Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our Deason discussions today. We'll be discussing policing and public safety in the future with the director of the ABA's Legal Education Police Practices Consortium, Jessalyn Walker. My name is Kenitra Brown. I am the staff attorney and the director of engagement at the Deason Criminal Justice Reform Center here at the SMU Dedman School of Law. The Deason Center is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy and advocacy research center. And we have three major buckets of research that we do around public defense, prosecutorial discretion, and we've kind of built a niche for ourselves in the small, tribal, and rural criminal justice space, where we look at issues unique or specific to areas that are under-resourced or with innovative practices in small, tribal, and rural areas. Part of our programming, a part of our engagement programming, includes information about criminal justice programs and criminal justice reform issues that go beyond our main areas of research. So as part of that, one of our series, the Decent Discussion series, usually involves upcoming or hot topics in criminal law. This series started out as a lunch and learn opportunity for SMU law students and has expanded to hot topics for anyone who may be interested in listening in from the community, from other law schools, and from in any classifications at any schools. This time, I am very excited to welcome Jessalyn Walker to discuss the LEPPC project, its length of time, and to discuss basically what it is and what it's looking like for the next 5 years of its existence. For now, I'd like to introduce our speaker. The director, Jessalyn Walker, managed an international portfolio of work promoting a community-oriented approach to policing from 2025 to 2020, with a specific focus on countries affected by the threat of violent extremism. She included in this work outreach and engagement with police, facilitating training opportunities with police leadership, frontline officers, and academy trainers, assessing and creating police curricula for both new recruits and in-service officers, and working with local partners to augment mandatory training to support the understanding of a community-oriented approach to policing. She has engaged with policing services of Jordan, Kosovo, Nigeria, Northern Ireland, the Maldives, and Tanzania. She is the co-author of Community-Oriented Policing for CVE Capacity, Adopting the Ethos Through Enhanced Training, and was the study director for Policing to Promote the Rule of Law and Protect the Population, an evidence-based approach, which was published by the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine in 2021. Jessalyn has a master's degree in criminology from the University College of Cork, England. I always want to say Cork, but she can correct me. Yeah,
Cork, Ireland.
and an undergraduate degree in sociology and politics. A few housekeeping rules before Jessalyn starts her presentation. Again, this is a lunch hour, so if you want to eat, please feel free to eat. You don't have to show that on camera, but if you can show your face, please do. Also, if you'd like to introduce yourself, because in the chat, please do so that we can get a feel for who's in the room. You don't have to, but it would be great. I'll start out in just a sec. And I'll ask for everyone to please hold any questions until after Jessalyn's presentation. But this is actually very intended to be a engagement session. So you are free to ask questions once the presentation is done, and it'll be a pretty open Q&A format. So we're looking forward to the presentation. Thank you.
Kenitra, thank you so much for that warm introduction. And I challenge anyone not to feel uncomfortable when they're having their bio read in the start of a webinar. We're really grateful for this opportunity to speak with you today. One thing I wanted to flag at the outset, as was mentioned, my background is in criminology, sociology, and politics. I do think that perspective brings a different approach to how I tackle this conversation, but would like to say from the outset that if you have particular legal questions, I am not here to address those. As well, while I am a representative of the American Bar Association, only the president of the ABA can speak on behalf of the group. So I am here today speaking in my capacity as director of the Legal Education Police Practices Consortium. While I do have a lot of enthusiasm and positive energy around this conversation, I do want to start this talk by acknowledging the death of Amir Locke last week. I think recognizing his death at the hands of police is an important and poignant reminder of the need to continue this conversation. You will forgive me momentarily while I share my screen with a promise not to kill anyone through PowerPoint, but just a few slides to help guiding our conversation today. Great. Can I get some thumbs up from folks? Okay, awesome. Great.
Jessalyn, you're going to want to switch to presenter mode. Sorry.
I appreciate it. Thank you. And
Excellent. Sorry.
ça va? Like that? Wonderful. Great. Thank you. Almost 2 years in, and as many have said, we're still learning the etiquette and screen sharing capabilities. So as mentioned, I'm here to discuss a project that is very important to me as well as to the American Bar Association. Following the fatal police interactions of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Daunte Wright, as well as so many others, and the global response demanding reforms in policing, deans of multiple law schools were eager to see this conversation turn into concrete change that supported the rule of law and the realization of public safety for all. There were individual activities, courses, and police outreach happening at individual law schools, but the deans wanted to ensure that learning and good practice was shared across the network to promote a larger community of practice and power. With the ABA's established convening power, network of accredited law schools, and published policies in support of eliminating real and perceived racial and identity-based biases in the criminal legal system, it made sense for the initiative to be housed here. Thus resulted in the presidential project, later known as the Legal Education Police Practices Consortium, or in shorthand, LEPPC, so we don't have to tire ourselves out saying that every time. The project goals you'll see here, we aim to contribute to the national effort examining and addressing legal issues in policing and public safety, including conduct, oversight, and the evolving nature of police work. We leverage the ABA's expertise and that of participating ABA law schools to collaborate on projects to develop and implement better police practices throughout the United States. I'm often asked why we're engaging with law schools rather than police academies or directly with policing agencies. And the reason for this is to ensure that the schools and law libraries are aware of the research that is being undertaken by their faculty, and to support the understanding of the lawyers of tomorrow who may be continuing this work, whether in court, in research, or in policy themselves. Here is a very, I recognize, very small list. I can drop in the chat later a more legible overview of the schools that are currently involved. But at present, we have 59 law schools representing 32 states participating in the consortium. We are always eager to expand. And so if you have connections at law schools not currently represented, I would be keen to discuss that in more detail. We are overseen by an advisory committee that, again, attempts to represent the diversity, both geographic and racial identities of the consortium. And we have the list of deans who oversee us here. Program activities, we have a few different lines of effort. There is the Consortium Fellowship, which I'll speak about in a bit more detail momentarily, the goal of which is to promote the understanding of policing practices for law students, including research and data gathering. We're currently working on a Law of Police course for consideration across consortium member schools. This is on offer at some of our member schools, but not all. And so in coordination, we are attempting to compile all of the syllabi currently on offer and create a menu of options for various member schools to consider to determine whether or not they want to have that on offer themselves. We also have an ongoing webinar series. We have a Law of Police scholarly database, as well as the Police Practices and Reform Events calendar. So our Consortium Fellowship this year, it was started in late January. We currently have 39 fellows from 33 participating schools from 25 states and the District of Columbia. In putting together our conversation series, we obviously wanted our fellows to undertake localized research while supporting their understanding of larger policing themes. So the themes for this year are available in front of you now, also based on some of my past experience and areas where I recognized I simply did not know enough and was keen to hear from external speakers. So we're also intentional about trying to promote a multidisciplinary approach in these conversations by inviting both criminologists, you can sense my bias, police leaders, as well as trainers, as well as legal experts and scholars. So our themes for this year are officer recruitment, retention, and promotion, assessing officer training, policing protests, role of police unions, use of force policies, and crafting policing policies. We're also planning a screening of Ernie and Joe Crisis Cops, which is a documentary that discusses how police officers can partner with mental health agencies to support their communities more directly. Our hope from the initial year of the fellowship was to structure it so that all students were undertaking the same assignment, but focused on their local jurisdiction to highlight the diversity of our network while also affording additional insight into the current events and needs of the communities represented. As well, recognizing this is our first attempt, we wanted to encourage as much involvement as possible and structure the work in a way that would be approachable for individuals at different points of their learning careers, particularly as it relates to policing. We do intend for the fellowship to be an annual opportunity, and of course, we'll continue to learn from our experiences this first year. The fellowship data gathering that will be undertaken by our fellows will include what I am referring to from my peace building perspective is fellowship data gathering and stakeholder mapping. It's the start of our context assessment to determine who is driving and mitigating the current context related to policing, public safety, and reform efforts. We want to determine who does what policies inform their activities, and who has oversight over them. From my work in some of with policing agencies overseas, I came upon this turn of phrase, which is know who you need to know before you need to know them. And I think this framing is really important, both in how police engage with their communities, as well as how we determine how to address the larger issue of reform. We need to understand who is currently operating in this space, what they have undertaken, what they have learned, before we can determine how we are best positioned to support them going forward. Again, here at the ABA and from an advisory committee perspective, we know some of this context, but it's the people on the ground who know more and who have greater access. So we want to ensure that we are elevating that local perspective and understanding. For each category that is reflected on your screen now, students will be collecting the data that is publicly available related to the demographic data of the department, training requirements and materials, the approximate budget, laws that govern them, and then points of contact. So if, for example, for including police leadership, legal advisors, public affairs, internal affairs, complaints, police unions, oversight boards, mental health agencies with whom they work in the community. In addition, these students will also be collecting the policies, such as body-worn camera policies, use of force policies, and consent decrees. I want to emphasize the fact that for this initial year, we are only asking the fellows to focus on what is publicly available. This is partly because we are operating under a do no harm umbrella, as well as a conflict sensitive framing. We do not want to proceed with FOIA requests for the initial year. We instead want to determine what is publicly available, what have departments determined is of most need for their communities, and what is not there. We see this in and of itself as a valuable data point. Going forward, we may consider that inclusion. However, we want to also ensure that policing departments are aware of who we are as an organization and determine if it might be more appropriate to engage with them directly rather than trying to go through the FOIA process. We were limited in our initial police contact for the reason that, again, we are just getting started, and we want that initial point person to not be the fellows. We think it more appropriate for that engagement to happen at either the faculty advisor level, from myself, or from the deans. We do not want that burden to be carried by the fellows, recognizing they may only be in that position for a short period of time, and also wanting to provide additional support and guidance in that regard. There is a great deal that can go wrong through that initial first impression. While there's also a lot that can go right, we want to ensure that we are protecting both the students as well as their local departments as much as possible, and having a streamlined approach in our communications and outreach. Research in and of itself can bring harms and benefits. It's more than just pursuing knowledge, as it can foster social action, build community, prompt dialogue, and increase understanding between groups. And we're trying to emphasize that approach as much as possible. In terms of ongoing engagement, again, I want to stipulate that the fellowship is anticipated as an annual opportunity. And so if this is something of interest to you, I would encourage you to keep your ear to the ground about upcoming announcements in that regard. Also, all of the data that is being collected by our fellows this year will be compiled into a publicly available database, inshallah, by the end of this year. So if that is of interest to you, then you'll be able to engage with that data, see what we have available to us, as well as assisting in the gaps analysis, what we are still lacking, what we are looking for. The intent behind making that information publicly available is, well, personally, I am a big fan of making everything as publicly available as possible. But we are hoping that that can be of use both, or to all of the stakeholders currently engaged in this conversation, to the community members working in this space who want to know who else is currently working in it, what work they have done, what connections they have established, to the academics who might be curious to see what information is available to determine how they are best positioned to support that next step in the reform or reimagining process, as well as to our policing partners, so that they have a centralized database where they might be able to compare their budget to their neighboring jurisdiction and determine where there have been discrepancies, or to say there is more training hours allocated across a state border, and that that has been linked to a lower incidence of use of force complaints against their department. We think having that comparison, and again, making it as approachable and intuitive to our audience as possible, can only reap benefits. From a consortium perspective, we as well will continue to monitor and maintain that database, while also trying to determine how that can inform our next steps in our process to reimagine public safety. That I'm going to stop sharing my screen and invite questions and feedback.
Thank you so much, Jessalyn, for that presentation. It's very helpful, and for setting forth the guidelines and the methods you guys are using for the project. I want to kind of go a little bit more into the specifics around the project's intention for the first year. It's data gathering. Thank you for dropping that in the chat. It's data gathering, but over time, what's the expectation for the length of the project, for recruiting new fellows, and as well as the database? What does the LEPPC hope for this to turn into moving forward?
So for the initial, I'm calling it a trial period, all of our member schools have committed to the consortium for a period of 5 years. I am cautiously optimistic that that will carry on beyond that time period. While I see the value of this work, I do recognize that we have a lot to accomplish, and a 5-year period, I don't know that it will be possible to do all of that within that time. So again, an initial period of 5 years, but going forward, inshallah, we will have additional opportunity to carry on this work. For the fellows, again, we anticipate that being an annual opportunity. And so recognizing the first year is our stakeholder mapping, kind of our context assessment, we will be able to have a more clear picture of what is happening in each community currently represented by a fellow. So that once we have that to hand and can assess and dive into that with a bit more intentionality, each fellowship going forward can then drill a bit more deeply into themes of most relevance to the communities where we are working. So that's why this first year is going to be so important in allowing us to get a read on what is happening in the spaces represented by the consortium, so that we can tailor assignments and be a bit more dynamic in our approach going forward. While this year we have one assignment for all of our fellows, I think going forward it would be of more interest and value to the students undertaking this work for there to be more of a localized understanding and a need that has been identified that they're more immediately and better able to address.
I'm going to take moderator's privilege one more time here. So at the beginning, you mentioned that there's different parts of this. It includes webinars, includes training, and you mentioned that the themes for the training were mostly based on information where you needed some updates. So as far as people who want to be aware of what the collab with LEPPC is doing, are those trainings just open to fellows? Are interested students, undergraduates, community members, are they also open? Would they also be invited to hear those trainings related to the law of police?
So at present, we have, again, to further divide our work, we have created a distinction between our webinars as well as the meetings for our fellows. Meetings for our fellows are closed and wholly off the record. We were intentional in structuring it in that way, one, to ensure that our external speakers were comfortable in bringing their fullest self to those discussions, as well as allowing our fellows the opportunity to ask whatever questions may arise. Then we have our webinar series. The webinar series is completely on the record. All of that is recorded and has been uploaded to our project page. And right now, throughout the fellowship series and those meetings, trying to figure out or determine some key themes that would be of interest to a wider audience so that we can ensure some of those lessons carry out further into the public. So those are two different meetings. Unfortunately, the ones for the fellows would not be open to the general public because we want those students to have the time to wholly engage with the subject matter as well as the speakers. The webinar series would be completely available, and I believe they're as students, you are all ABA members, correct? I'm not seeing any nodding, but
law students.
Law students.
Clarify.
Correct.
Law students,
Yes, law students
can be members of the ABA for free.
Correct.
I do, not just there are more than SMU law students in the room. So I do encourage you guys, just in general, as a former law student, for organizations where you can get free membership as a student to join so that you can get access to those resources while you're in law school. You never know how helpful they could be. But also just the ABA is just a really great resource on not just this, but several other resources as well. Just a plug there. I don't have to make the plug, but I'm making it because um, you're still students and your budgets. So take advantage of free memberships.
Most definitely. And so our project is housed within the criminal justice section. So by enrolling in that listserv, you should have access to any public webinars that we are hosting. Those are also uploaded to our website. So I also keep it kind of an antiquated listserv just in an Excel spreadsheet. So if you're interested in more direct communication and outreach, I'm happy to capture your details and ensure that information is shared with you as well. Kenitra, as well, thank you for that stump on behalf of the ABA. I appreciate you.
You're welcome. So I want to think kind of future, like a year or two from now. One of the things that's been discussed as one of the other reasons why law schools were a good place to kind of build this collaboration is because there are legal scholars in this space doing work. It seems obvious, but but it's not often known to law students, to any students, about the law of police or what that means, or who's doing, like when scholars are doing work on policing, what that means. This is a very broad question, but can you talk about any efforts or any future talks around including that scholarship or building curriculum around educating not just law students, but specifically law students, but other types of students or interested communities on the law of police, what's happening with the scholars in the space that are doing the work, and how that will relate to the collaboration between the ABA and the law schools to LEPPC.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So we did host a webinar. It's now February. This was end of last month with Professor Rachel Harmon from the University of Virginia, who recently published the first of its kind casebook entitled The Law of the Police. There are a few other webinars online where she breaks it down in really digestible, approachable ways to determine what sessions, what modules might be of relevance and might be incorporated into existing courses. We are currently attempting to work through that casebook as well as with other law of police courses that might exist within consortium member schools and collecting their syllabi and course materials to create a menu of options that might be adapted for member schools. So if there is a 1 hour session that that a lecturer or faculty advisor is looking for support on, that we would be seen as a repository of that information so that someone could come to our website, realize that it has already been developed by a consortium member school, recognize they don't need to reinvent the wheel in order to ensure that this material is shared across their school. The other component of training that we are in the early stages of developing and are trying to determine the best way to proceed is ensuring that law of police course, while first made available to law schools, might also be of value to local policing departments, and trying to ensure that there is access, training space, and adequately trained faculty, professors who might be able to relay that message. We want to provide opportunities for dialogue between communities and their policing departments. And one way we can do that is by availing of the campus location and the pre-made training environment that exists within each of our consortium member schools. And I think by creating new incentives for additional training can only lead to success and greater collaboration in this conversation going forward. Sorry, Kenitra, if I might, just in doing our, we did a bit of an overview of the course catalogs of consortium member schools to determine who currently has a course on policing related to criminal justice, and have an overview of what the names of those courses are, as well as the faculty responsible. But we are, again, trying to collect each of those syllabi so that we have a more in-depth understanding beyond just the title of what is being taught. So if there are those courses on offer at SMU or at other schools represented by students here today, I would gladly accept that information with the utmost gratitude, recognizing that that would need to also be signed off by the relevant faculty, but to put any concerns they might have to rest, information would only be used to further inspire and work off of their existing good work in this space.
May I ask, is that already publicly available or is that still a work in progress?
It is still a work in progress. I have a Google Doc that I'm happy to share, but that is not yet, because it is still in flux and was based honestly just off of a very precursory overview of course catalogs. It's not just super in depth, but if it's of interest, I'm happy to pull it up and share it. One course, the training component gets me very excited, so feel free to rein me back in if this becomes too much of a monologue. But another course that's on offer at one of our member schools is Policing the Police. And I think that perspective, again, while I do not have that syllabi to hand, is really interesting and ensures that law students, I think it's available for law students as well as undergraduate students, is really valuable for students in determining what their role as a community member is, what their role as a lawyer tomorrow might be, as well as being able to play more of an active bystander if and when they do see something going amiss. So that is another plug that's on offer at our New York Law School and is taught by Kirk Burkhalter.
This question is not necessarily actually about the LEPPC, but more about your experience and kind of what you've seen as someone who's worked with police departments and training with community resources in different countries, and then looking here. I wonder what you think. I mean, and I am not asking for this as a representative of the ABA. I'm asking as in your experience, what you see as some of the approaches that you've recommended or seen in other countries that could work here, or that the conduct that or could explain the disparate impacts of policing in the US compared to other countries. I think when people see things about like what happened with the mirror lock and things like this, that outrages, that you can't convince people that people in the US are inherently more dangerous or more criminal than people in other countries, and yet there aren't as many as much police-related violence in those other countries. So I wonder what you, just in your personal opinion, not ABA, not ABA, but in your experience, can see as something that works in other places, that could work here or that could explain the difference here.
So first, I want to acknowledge that I have worked in a handful of countries and only with their national policing service. So what I'm about to say would be in reference to the national level curriculum, recognizing there is a fair bit of deviation as it trickles down and how it operates in different contexts. But from my experience working overseas, one of the first things that struck me was the receptivity to change and recognition that the only good can come from accepting support and from attempting to be more aligned with the needs and desires of the community. And in that work, I was also reviewing national level police training curricula, and the way that was structured, I found absolutely fascinating, because typically, actually in all circumstances, it is significantly longer than what is on offer here in the United States. Recognizing we have 18,000 different policing services within the US, however, it struck me that countries where we were going to support from a US government perspective already had a longer, more intense training capacity. To that end, however, it was often structured around, and I'm confident most folks have heard this conversation already, but structured around this militarized ideal to ensure that the resultant officer who came out of the police academy still had that confrontational, combative relationship and idea of the community with whom they were then working. For example, there was an excessive, I won't pinpoint any one country because I don't want to put anyone on blast, but in the majority of countries, there would be weeks allocated towards marching and drill assignments. Obviously, well, all of the countries where I was working, they were all armed policing officers, and so a great deal of time allocated to weapons training. And when I went in saying we are trying to include a more community-oriented approach to their training, the majority of the people within their internal affairs departments or their training departments would say, oh, no, it's grand, we don't need that. Sure, we already have a course on that. I said, great, well, that's awesome. You're ahead of the game. Let's see what you're teaching. And they would pull out a curriculum for about an hour session that is teaching something about engagement and about the need for community conversations and dialogue. However, when there is 1 hour included in a 3-month training span, the larger training ethos that is being promoted obviously runs contrary to what that 1 hour is saying. So we were trying to really work to reorient that whole model to center the community in that conversation, as well as incorporating some pretty key peace building principles into the conversation. So trying to promote an understanding of dialogue, of mediation, of negotiation for frontline officers from day one, as well as understanding the root causes of crime and violence, which as a criminologist, it was fascinating to me to see that Criminology 101 isn't taught to a lot of police officers. And so trying to think through how that might be incorporated into the core curriculum for both the new recruit officers initially, but then recognizing we also need to engage with the top brass. So what kind of ongoing in-service training opportunities are available to ensure that the service that new recruits enter is in keeping with the training environment that they've just graduated from. So we're trying to determine if it's better to go from the bottom up or the top down. Really, our focus then became trying to ensure that we were doing both simultaneously, which as a small project was quite challenging. But yeah, trying to make sure that that leadership support also existed was really influential. But from that review process, going to the second part of your question, from what I remember, is again, recognizing what is not currently being taught here in the United States is really eye-opening, that there may be in-service opportunities for officers to better engage with their community, to better learn about dialogue, mediation, some mental health concerns, either within the community or within the policing organization as a whole. But the fact that they're not embedded in the core curriculum of the new recruit, to me shows that it's not as much of an ethos of the organization. It's not something that is that does not have a spotlight on it from day one. And that becomes exceptionally challenging for folks who are trying to grow within this field and to become the officers in protection of public safety that I think so much of our community, so many communities are advocating for.
Kind of on that same thread of what's not taught to police officers is what's not taught to people, community members themselves. For the most part, most people on this call are either law students or have some interest in law, but I saw someone introduce themselves who it has an initiative called the director of the Hood Medicine Initiative. It's a JD, but I imagine that there's some other people on the call who don't use their lawyering in the ways that we normally think about lawyers, and you're not a lawyer yourself. So you do this work and you're not a lawyer. But there are people who want to know or who plan to do their lawyering in corporate laws, but are interested generally as community members in this work. That's the first part. The second part is a lot of the conversations over the past couple of years haven't just been about, or the extension, the natural extension of talking about policing is what's all involved in public safety. The movie you mentioned, the crisis police. There are other ways to ensure public safety without wholly relying on police departments. So I guess I wonder is, with your experience with your work as a criminologist, what do you see as communities' roles and how can they learn these things? What can they do, or what can lay people do in their communities to, inform the conversation around public safety?
I'm reluctant to put that ball squarely on the shoulders of community members, but I do recognize there is a great deal of work that can be done there. And so again, try to advocate for a top-down and bottom-up approach so that we are able to capture as much as possible. And so doing your research, recognizing what is happening on the ground, what are the local sentiments, who are the organizations who are working in this space, what are their stances, what are their stumbling blocks, I think is really valuable. Since we have transitioned to so much of these things happening in the virtual space, there are a wealth of webinars that we are attempting to collate on the police practices resources calendar that I would encourage you to engage with just for additional understanding. And I can't, again, not as an ABA person, but I've got to stress, like, call your representatives, because I live in DC and I feel so challenged by the fact that I do not have that representation, and thus my voice is not heard as loudly as others. That is a real point of frustration. And so if there are things that are happening in your community that you feel are not being addressed appropriately, if there are local initiatives that you want to spotlight, I know there are local community groups that are made available for that. And I think one of the core components of, I take one step back to recognize that community policing, community-oriented policing, either of those two turns of phrases, for an extended period of time have been very watered down and mean very different things to different people. One group that I have recognized and am not currently affiliated with, but do want to give a shout out to, is the Black and Blue Initiative. And I'll drop their link in the chat. This is a group that is really trying to understand and engage with a whole of community approach when they're talking about communities policing. So there's actually a survey that you can do on their website as a community member to talk about what is happening in your area. What is your impression of your policing department? What interactions, positive or negative, have you had? In addition, which I think is just driving this conversation even more in the right direction, is they're also asking about what access do you have to a grocery store? How close is your local library? Is Wi-Fi or broadband readily available to people without that in their homes? What is your access to education, and how close is your local school? And I think by, again, doing that community-led initiative and allowing our individual voices to feed into that type of survey, that data can be further pushed to the relevant policymakers and say, like, okay, you might say that you have this line item in a budget allocated towards public safety, but your community still doesn't feel it. So this is what they're saying they need in addition to what has been created to ensure that they feel supported. That might mean that policing is not prioritized and that additional funds are needed to ensure there's a grocery store in your community, and that access to nutritional safety needs to be elevated in a way that the role of policing doesn't need to be. I think it creates a really interesting way to prioritize the needs, as well as elevate folks at the most who might not have felt that they had an opportunity to share their voice before. And I do think just that is part of the goal as well of our initial stakeholder mapping of the fellowship, is to get a read on who is doing what, and once that is made publicly available, to allow people to engage with those people directly, to get more information about where they're coming from and what their work might entail, identify opportunities for volunteering, or see how they might become more engaged. And Kenitra, I think I overlooked a question that you posed earlier, so you'll forgive me for circling back, but just recognizing the long term that I've just referenced, because we have this 5-year initial plan. I think going forward, again, we'll hope to drill down more deeply into the needs of each particular community and have more research, have more understanding of what is taking place in each space that is represented either by a consortium member school or an interested party. I'm hoping to develop more opportunities for volunteering and engagement from both the communities represented by law schools as well as outside of it, so that there is greater chance for people who may feel that they want to engage with this material but aren't entirely sure of what their stage might be. I'm hoping that the consortium can support them in creating one.
Thank you. Jonathan has his hand up. Jonathan, feel free to ask your question.
How you doing, Mrs. Walker? Good to talk to you again. My question is, leading up to the 1994 crime bill, we had a spate of people from within the community, religious leaders, politicians, complaining about crime in the area and presenting it as a primarily law enforcement issue. And we've seen the reaction and the cost of the 94 crime bill and its disparate impact on communities of color. It seems like we're entering into a new conversation about crime in these communities, where we're having the same sort of perspective offered to law enforcement, that the community needs them to come in and stop these waves of crime. What do you see happening today to prevent us from going back to the situations we dealt with after the crime bill and the way it ravaged communities of color?
Jonathan, I'm in no way surprised that you're here with some very challenging questions. I don't know that I have the answer to that. I think I am always heartened by again, and I don't mean to put all of this, the pressure to drive this change process forward on the shoulders of community members. I recognize that it needs to also come from policymakers as well as those in public office. But of course, one leads to the next. I think I guess I'm going to adopt an optimistic voice in attempting to answer the question, but then would also like to hear from others in the audience. But I would like to think that we know a bit more now, that we have seen some of the impact and the direct loss experienced, particularly by communities of color and disenfranchised communities, by overly tactical police responses and this heavy-handed approach. And so I would, again, the idealistic part of me would like to say that with this perspective comes some learning, and we are recognizing that we are attempting to take a step forward in this space and that we can learn from our missteps. I'm not confident that that is always going to be the case, but I would like to think that with the with the protests that took place in 2020, with the Black Lives Matter movement that I think has spurred so much great activism and awareness, as well as the number of groups that have responded and positioned themselves as key voices in this conversation, that they will help in driving our change forward in a way that responds to the needs of all communities, as opposed to the ones I recognize were represented and centered in the crime bill referenced. But again, that feels a bit outside my wheelhouse. So if there are others with different perspectives, I would love to hear about it.
I don't know that I have a different perspective, but I hope that a public repository, like what you're building and some of the lessons learned after the first year, might also inform that conversation about who officers or communities are listening to, with a public repository or with some, with some data, with some access to some of the data, with some access to some of the scholarship in this space, that people are better able to, like, or maybe the fact that something isn't publicly available. So that people can say the fact that there are two behemoth organizations looking into publicly available training materials, or publicly available mission statements, or publicly available goals, or for specific police departments or agencies. The fact that we don't have these means that, these departments aren't responsive to the community. And here's this proof, or here are these people in this space that are saying that the way that we've done this hasn't worked. You've not made your data available. Let's try a different way. It's my hope that having this, the ABAs and the law schools, in collaboration with this and creating a public repository, could help with those conversations. Whether or not they can actually make public statements, it's the fact that that work is there. People who are making those public statements might be able to find it or make inferences for what's there and what's not there. So
100%. I feel like you can't actively engage in this conversation without some degree of hope, right? It's got to be what spurs us. And I think also, going back to Kenitra, exactly what you said, but from a different perspective, by making it publicly accessible, we're also hoping, as I mentioned, that law enforcement will engage with this material. And so I'm in today from Washington, D.C. If DC were to say, okay, well, our neighbors in Baltimore have made this available, maybe we should too, that there could be more conversation about what transparency can look like, and just trying to determine what has been made available from different departments, as well as trying to promote only greater accountability and transparency. I think, Terry, I don't mean to put you on the spotlight, but I saw a hand raised.
I guess I was just going to, I kind of want you to hear me clearly, just sometimes I'm asking my setup. I was just going to say I had a different perspective, agreeing with your point on the resources of the Black and Blue Partnership. I think a lot of communities have funded resources and things like that. And when it comes to certain problems that happen within that community, it kind of seems like a pass the baton, like that's not me to enforce that, that's this office, that's not this office, that's the lawmaker, that's not this person, so it kind of becomes a very paper, trail of, I don't know what office to go to, I don't know who to talk to, I don't know how to get this problem solved, but I'm still in this certain situation. And I think policing is kind of like, it just became like a general end all be all of like, you did this, and since you didn't know the resource, we just now have to do this general, reactionary thing. And I think that's where a really good organization that says, hey, you don't have enough money for food, you need a grocery store, or you need more jobs in your area, or you need more Wi-Fi for you to learn more about what is not there, for you to maybe give yourself or not give yourself, but maybe offer more resources as well as answers to your questions. I hope that makes sense, but I just think that that is a really good way to enforce that transparency of what is exactly is needed and put a face to the office that can answer that question instead of, just, I don't know, I need this now, and impulse decision making that has kind of led to a lot of worse off decisions, as we can see.
Yes.
Jessalyn, is that something that the first wave will capture as they look up, agencies, politicians, oversight committees? Will there also be a place to put, like, this is where complaints are made, or this is who? Is that first level, or will that be a little later
That,
after you've gotten a heel on particular jurisdictions?
that will be subsequent. And again, I think the first one, we're collecting points of contact, so who the person is, what their term of service is, how to get in touch with them. And then we will be using that information to engage more directly with each local policing department and identify what are some of the areas for growth that they have identified. And I think once those more direct engagements have been established, we will be in a better position to proceed and determine how we can continue the conversation going forward, as well as having, again, ideally, greater access to some of those complaints logs if they are not publicly available, to some of the demographics of individuals arrested or who engage with the policing agencies.
Nice. For everyone, we're coming up on the end of our time here. I, I want to ask if anyone has any parting thoughts before I turn it over to Jessalyn for any parting thoughts. Yeah, any last minute comments, things to keep in mind moving forward? Oh, Jonathan.
I just want to thank you for having this. These are great conversations to have, and I think we have to continue to believe that we can reimagine the way policing is done in this country. Because at the end of the day, if one innocent individual is harmed by law enforcement unnecessarily, then our system is broken. We live in a society where law enforcement is there to serve and protect its citizenry, and every year when people who are innocent are harmed by these officers, it destroys the credibility of the agency, and we can't see where an ACA supporting as law enforcement doesn't have the credibility.
I think we lost Jonathan there, but for those of you who had a difficult time hearing him, the captions caught some of that, and basically his comments were that we have to lead into these conversations with hope, and we have an obligation to make sure that these organizations still have or to prevent innocent people from being caught, and some of the policies of these organizations, and that the policies actually work to increase public trust in these organizations or in these agencies. Before I close out, I'm going to let Jessalyn have any last words, and then I have a few more announcements before we sign off. Jessalyn, any last words?
Just a lot of gratitude for folks for being here today. Really appreciative of your attendance, as well as those who had your cameras on, your active engagement from a speaking perspective. That's always encouraging, so appreciate you. Those who are listening, also hoping that you learned something, or if you have continued questions or challenges to how we're approaching this work, I am all ears and really wanted to invite that perspective as well. I've dropped in the chat my email address, as well as a link to a current bibliography of Law of the Police scholars who are currently working in this space. That is still being updated and will be uploaded to our website. I know I also made a promise to provide an overview of courses on offer at both consortium and non-consortium member schools related to policing. I can't find it to hand. I know I have it, but it's just not bookmarked. So if you drop me an email, I'm happy to send that to you if that's of interest. We're also planning on renovating and updating our website to make it much more user-friendly. So please stay tuned in that regard as well, because all of that information will be uploaded to the site again, inshallah, in the coming months. Thank you so much for having me. And Kenitra, thank you so much for this, the opportunity.
Thank you so much, Jessalyn. Sorry, having moments. I'm definitely planning to invite you back after the fellows get a little deeper into their research and you have a little bit more insight. I'm also planning to invite you back to help you with recruiting, with recruiting fellows. So if there are any undergraduates on this call, there will still be fellowship work for you when you eventually decide if you want to come to law school, if that's your decision. I've also posted in the chat bit.ly link to our events, our remaining events for the spring semester from the Deason Center. As I mentioned, we put on programming across the spectrum of criminal legal projects, or criminal legal reform. We have an upcoming event at the end of February featuring Professor Maybelle Romero. You saw her name earlier in Jessalyn's presentation. Professor Jacqueline Bridgeland and Dr. Lorenzo Boyd, as they discuss access to justice to people of color in rural spaces or in STAR spaces, small, tribal, and rural. But they'll be focusing on specific issues around criminal legal systems and access to justice for people of color in rural spaces. I'm plugging this event especially in our STAR series because it's centering the voices of people of color, of Black, Asian, Latinx, and Native Americans in this conversation, because we don't tend to think of people of color when we talk about rural criminal justice or rural issues in general. So it's going to be a really, really exciting event. And I'm interested in the conversation and the centering of people who aren't usually the first that we think of when we talk about rural America and rural criminal justice. So the remainder of our spring semester events are also available on those links. So be sure to take a look at that link. So be sure to take a look at the calendar and register for our upcoming events. We look forward to seeing you there. You can also visit our website, which someone drop in the chat for me. That website will also give you access to what we do at the Deason Center, to some of our projects and programming, and to give you an update on upcoming projects that we're doing. And if you want to sign up for our newsletters and our programming events so that you can be aware of what's coming out of the center, there's an option for that too. So I want to thank all of you for showing up. We will see most of you next time. I look forward to it. And please feel free to send any questions that you have about the LEPPC to Jessalyn. She put her email in the chat, and send any questions about the Deason Center to me. I thank you guys. We'll see you later.